Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to APTA's Future View webinar, focusing on the topic of resiliency today. Our webinar title is Building a Resilient Transit System, How to Keep the System Running When Disasters Strike. My name is Elizabeth Lovingood, and I'll be your moderator for today's session. I serve as APTA's Program Manager for Sustainability and Planning, and in my work, I support our APTA Standards Program, which sets out consensus-based industry guidance on a variety of topics, including robust working groups on climate action planning and transit asset management. Both will be touched on lightly today. APTA is delighted to welcome our members, as well as guests from across North America, to today's session. And we're bringing together a really exciting and informative group of industry experts on today's webinar. Our topic speaks to the changing landscape of our environment and how our industry, how we plan, how we react, and how we recover from these changes and these disruptions. Most scientists will agree that climate change has already occurred, and in fact, it's reflected in our weather patterns already. These changes and impacts will only continue, and they'll accelerate in the future. This means more and more extreme weather events, such as hurricanes or winter storms, as well as overall temperature changes, which will have long-lasting impacts on our infrastructure and on our services. Both provide threats to our systems and to our operations. Transit is also increasingly dependent on technologies, so the event of a power outage or a cybersecurity attack could be crippling to one of our systems. Because of this, transit agencies need to be more flexible in their planning and their decision-making processes, and to actively build a resilience to such events and threats. And by resilience, I mean the ability to prepare and plan for, to absorb, respond, recover from, and then more successfully adapt from these disruptions in the future. This resilience will become vital for protecting our current and future investments and maintain the safe operations of our systems. The threat of these events and impacts occurring is increasing, and agencies must take action now to reduce the future consequences. Proactive spending on resiliency measures will save agencies money in the long run, and it'll enable them to rebound more quickly and also to serve their customers more effectively. Some agencies have risen to the challenge posed by climate change and other events, but many have not made the transition from everyday practices into a comprehensive, forward-looking, risk-based approach to resilience, which is needed. The industry must work together in partnership to become more prepared and more resilient to these threats, which means adapting current strategic, capital, and operational plans. These changes or adaptations can entail adjusting how transportation infrastructure is planned for, designed, built, maintained, and operated. This is one of the reasons that APTA is holding this webinar today, is to ensure that we are sharing lessons learned and best practices so that we can continue the operations of vital services that our transit systems provide. So during today's session, I encourage you to think about how your agency should be thinking more strategically when building a resiliency plan and being more prepared for climate-related events and impacts, as well as other threats, and then how you can adopt these resiliency policies, strategies, and practices into the following areas: policy, planning, administration, and safety, asset management and capital programming, project development, infrastructure design and construction, operations and maintenance, emergency preparedness, response, and recovery. These areas were actually domains pulled from a recent TCRP guidance titled Improving the Resilience of Transit Systems Threatened by Natural Disasters, which was completed in 2017 and really is an incredible resource for transit agencies. It includes an extensive literature review of the current state of practice, as well as 17 case studies and a guidebook for agencies that comes with an online database of tools that you can search. So if you're interested in learning more, I really encourage you to take a look. So today we'll hear from 3 speakers and we'll focus on how to develop a climate resilience plan, how to move infrastructure and transit agencies forward while ensuring resiliency in our critical systems. We'll also hear a whole systems approach to empower resiliency. So there's a lot to learn and gain from today's speakers. They prepared some really great takeaways and some lessons learned. So get your pen and pad ready or open that blank Word document because you'll be taking some notes. I also encourage you to think about some questions that you have for each panelist or for all of the entire panel to address. And you can post these questions to the question box found on the screen on the right. and we'll address these questions in the second half of the program. So for today's program, please join me in welcoming the following industry leaders. Dr. Tom Wall, Senior Infrastructure and Preparedness Analyst from the Argonne National Laboratory. Tim Kelly, Executive Vice President of Operations, Public Safety, and Customer Service from the Metropolitan Transit Authority of Harris County, also known as Houston Metro. And Carlos Ortega, Director of Systems Engineering at Marta. So what you can expect for today is about 15 minutes of remarks from each of our speakers. And then after each speaker, I'll ask a question or two. And then after all presentations are concluded, we'll continue our conversation with the entire panel. And then we'll open up the floor for your questions submitted to the question box. As a reminder, the question box is on the right hand on the screen, and you can submit your questions there, and then we'll read them aloud and address them during the Q&A segment of the session. So without further ado, let's welcome our first panel member, Dr. Tom Wall of Argonne National Laboratory. APTA is really excited to have Dr. Wall present on this webinar and to share his wealth of expertise. Although transit and transportation are not the focus of his work at Argonne, you'll see how resiliency planning is important for other infrastructure-heavy industries and how transit can take some of these lessons and apply it to our own industry. So with that, Tom, the floor is yours.
Great, thanks, Elizabeth. Perfect. So I'm excited to be presenting today. Thank you for the opportunity. And what I want to do is spend the next several minutes talking about sort of a broad perspective on especially some of the early stages in developing a climate resilience plan. We've worked with a lot of different infrastructure sectors. Transportation is one, but we've also worked with the telecom sector, the energy sector, and so really there's a lot of overlap and a lot of similarities. And I think that one of the things that gets overlooked frequently are a lot of the early stages in climate resilience planning. So that's really what I'd like to focus on today. And I think there's some lessons learned from these broader areas and these broader projects that we've conducted that could be directly applicable to transit agencies or the broader transportation community. Next slide, please. So the first thing is just to clear up a matter of terminology. The term climate adaptation has been around for a long time, for several decades. And over the last several years, the term climate resiliency is slowly edged in to try and either replace that or complement that. I think really if we're doing adaptation from a holistic, comprehensive, full business perspective, including not just physical changes or modifications to infrastructure, but also changes to business practices, continuity of operations plans, emergency response planning, what we're really doing is climate resilience. And so I've put these definitions up there and highlighted some overlapping terms, but I really think that climate adaptation done comprehensively looks a lot like resilience. And there's a lot of guidance out there on different ways to do this. So the figure on the right is from Federal Highway Administration. It's their Vulnerability Assessment and Adaptation Framework. It's their third edition, and provides, I think, a pretty good roadmap for all of the steps in conducting adaptation or really broader climate resilience assessments. And I'd really like to focus, as I said, on some of the earlier steps, because I think that they're frequently overlooked as folks rush to conduct vulnerability assessments and look at adaptation options. And so I'm going to start by talking about some compiling data and climate data, and then I want to circle back to a couple of those steps in that first row of chevrons across the top of their figure. Next slide, please. So broadly speaking, we're a national lab. We do a lot of climate modeling and develop and run climate models. So I want to spend a little bit of time just for a baseline understanding of what is this data, where does it come from, what does it look like, and what can you expect, and also expect it to not be. Really, most global and regional climate models are physics-based models. And so what does that mean? In the center top left figure, the United States, or even this could be done more broadly for the globe, it's divided up into grid squares. And these models calculate using atmospheric physics-based and atmospheric chemistry relationships. They calculate climate. They calculate various climate variables for each of these grid cells for periods of time in the future. And as computing power has gotten better, as models have gotten better, these grid cells have gotten smaller and smaller. So we get higher resolution. The figure on the top right is about the current state of the art for global climate models. We have grid cells, maybe 50 to 100 kilometers on each side. But regional climate models, like the one in the center bottom, instead of looking at the entire globe, we're just looking at a smaller domain, a continent or a country. And because we're looking at a smaller space, we can have even smaller squares. So the current model that we have at Argonne, and really I think this is the current state of the art for regional climate modeling, we get down to 12-kilometer grid cells. And so what does that look like? The figure on the right is what the 12-kilometer grid looks like in Chicago. So we're able to project not just at a city scale or a state level scale, but really at this, sub-city scale, what different climate impacts can look like in the future. So we can look at different parts of Chicago or different parts of other major cities or different parts of states and really start getting detailed information about different locations across a region. The figure on the bottom left, that's the supercomputer we have here at Argonne. I had to give a plug for that because a lot of these models are very computing intensive, but the best models are really those that are physics-based, that are performing these future projection computations. And there are other approaches like statistical downscaling and other ways to get this real high-resolution, local detailed data, but they begin to lose some of those physical relationships, and we can talk about that more in questions if that's of interest to folks. Next slide, please. So these models produce a lot of different types of information, and some of this may be directly relevant to transit agencies or to transportation organizations, and some of them may not be. Things like precipitation, air temperature, right? We can easily conceive of how that could affect a transit system. Other things like soil moisture content, right? That's something that these models produce, but may not be directly relevant. So these climate model variables are the things that come directly out of models, but really it's what are climate impact information? What type of information can we get from these climate models that can directly impact our infrastructure that we need? And sometimes that requires some additional analysis or additional modeling. Next slide, please. So what a climate model produces really is, this is a climate record for what the weather was here in Illinois, where Argonne's located on Monday. Climate models are producing something that looks very similar to this, but for the future. So if you could advance one slide, please. So it's effectively projecting a climate record for 2050. And it's on an hour-by-hour basis. Some models are even, looking at every 15 minutes, they're saving data information. That's what I call raw climate data. That's not particularly useful. Like, we'd have to take everything in the temperature column and average it if we were looking for average temperature. We'd have to do some additional analysis. We wanted extremes, right? So the raw climate information is not all that useful to an infrastructure organization. Next slide, please. And so it's really, what is that additional analysis that can be done on top of just this raw climate data that makes it more directly applicable to folks like yourselves at agencies where you manage infrastructure and operations on a daily basis. And so this is an example of what we don't really care necessarily about precipitation. Our infrastructure is maybe more affected by flooding. And so in this example, we have the raw climate data. We have to conduct some additional analysis on that. That data can inform a stormwater runoff model and stream flows, and ultimately a floodplain analysis to look at what the figures on the right are showing, which is more decision relevant or actionable information about how flooding is impacted by climate. So I'm trying to get across here is some information that comes directly from a climate model may be useful, but to not be alarmed that to get to the types of information you need to more directly inform decisions, there can be some additional analysis that needs to be done. In the case of, say, extreme temperatures, we're not necessarily conducting additional environmental modeling in the case of here for stream flow and stuff for water, but there might be some statistical analysis that we need to do to go from that sort of projected future record of what daily temperatures may look like at some point in the future to say, all right, well, what does a heat wave look like in the future? Or what does that extreme temperature event look like? Next slide, please. And arriving at these types of climate impact variables is not trivial. So I want to loop back to one of the earlier steps in that federal highways framework that I outlined on one of the early slides, and really zero in on this other key early step of identifying key climate variables. So at Argonne, we recently conducted a large study with AT&T to look at climate impacts in the southeastern United States. It's about an 8-month project. Fully the first entire month of that project was a lot of conversations with network managers, network operators at AT&T, infrastructure engineers, infrastructure managers, operations folks, to just go back and forth over the course of a month and zero in on what type of information they actually needed to inform decision making. So as they're building new 5G networks across the country, and they're planning for that, that will require new cell towers. And they were concerned that changes in wind patterns may affect those cell towers. But that was a fairly oblique concern. And we needed to figure out, well, okay, we can produce lots of different kind of wind information to inform, how you design cell towers, but what do you actually need? And so it was an iterative process back and forth to zero in on, well, what we really need is peak wind intensities for the 50-year event at 10 meters above the ground and at 100 meters above the ground. We can get that very specific type of information, but I'm an engineer, but I work with a lot of climate scientists, and they don't necessarily know exactly what types of information industry needs to inform decisions. They can produce a lot of great stuff, but don't necessarily know what the engineer who's designing the structure for a cell tower needs to know about wind loadings in the future to inform that design. Next slide, please. And so, I've got the last couple slides here of I think some key questions and some key guidance very early on in the process. And really, the first question is, what time frame am I planning for? That's something where I think in broader transportation planning, we're looking 10 years into the future. If it's more operational investments, we're looking 5 years into the future. Climate's a lot further down the road than that. I mean, we're starting to see impacts in the nearer term, but a lot of the modeling is looking 10 or 20, 30 or 40 or 50 years in the future. And so careful thought needs to go into what time frame in the future are you planning for to align that with the infrastructure that you're building or maintaining, but also broader planning concerns. And then the second is something I've touched on a lot. What are the climate impact variables that you actually need to inform planning efforts? The figure on the bottom right shows flood exposure to coastal energy infrastructure. This was a separate project that we did. And it's really, we've got some flood depth information in there, but it's really just showing what's the exposure of this coastal energy infrastructure to flooding. But there's a lot of other factors. So vulnerability, this is just one definition I've found that I kind of like. That's vulnerability is a function of exposure, sensitivity, and adaptive capacity. If an electric substation, for example, experiences peak temperatures that go up by 10 degrees, that may not actually affect it, right? It's exposed to an increase in temperature, but it's not sensitive to a 10-degree increase in temperature. But if there's 10 inches more of water in the surrounding area, well, that could be something that could seriously affect that substation. And so these questions of sensitivity, adaptive capacity of my infrastructure, it's more nuanced than just am I exposed to climate impacts? What are the actual implications of those impacts to my infrastructure? And then another one is, and this is just I guess to zoom out very briefly, a much broader observation of making sure that everybody, every relevant person in the organization is at the table. There's a lot of great insight that we've gotten from people who are actually in the field conducting maintenance, who know infrastructure like the back of their hand, and the engagements that we've had when those folks are in the room, or when the data scientists and GIS staff who are going to have to manage this data and store it and make it usable for an agency or an organization, when they're in the room, in addition to the higher level leadership and management and planning folks, it really moves things forward, and we can really operationalize the data information and really get to that earlier question of what type of climate impact variables do I actually need to know about, because these are the folks who know that type of information. Next slide, please. So this is my last slide. I guess that if I had a couple of takeaway messages from my very brief presentation here, it's that I think we talk a lot about some of the later stages in climate resilience planning for assessments and looking at adaptation options, but I would really urge folks who are interested in this to not rush a lot of these early activities. spend a lot of time figuring out what those important climate variables are, what types of data and information you need to inform that, and then working with people outside of your organization to get that information. So that's really where I encourage you to seek partnerships. State climatologists are a great place to start. Every state has one, and they know the data landscape. They know things that are going to be occurring in your state, and they know the state level agencies, the federal agencies, the folks who can get you the type of information you need. NOAA is another one that has lots of regional offices that provide this type of data information. We've done some work with the folks in the Northeast with NOAA, and they've been a great resource. Universities, national laboratories, I'll give a plug for Argonne here, but there's lots of national laboratories that could do this kind of work. And then also, there's consulting firms and other types of organizations that can do this. TRB has a lot of guidance, and I've also published, I've put a couple of bullets here at the very bottom of just some low-hanging fruit from the transportation sector, of some guidance from FTA for climate adaptation. One is high-level guidance, and then a more recent one from 2013 is actually an asset management approach to climate adaptation. And then also the last one is that adaptation framework from Federal Highway Administration that I've shown a couple of times on the slide earlier. It's not just a framework, they also have a lot of text and guidance that accompanies that can really walk you through this process. But really, I think the key important part of this slide is that bullet that under Seek Partnerships for trying to find someone who can act as a climate interpreter. This is a term that Linda Mearns, who's with the National Center for Atmospheric Research, coined on a webinar that I was listening to that she was giving. And I really liked it because, there are people with engineering backgrounds and also climate backgrounds who can help you to walk through a lot of these early questions in conducting and setting up a climate resilience plan. And a lot of them are at those state climatologists, organizations or offices, universities, national labs. And once really finding that person to help be your guide or your concierge through a lot of that process, I think is an important person to locate. And maybe that person already exists in your organization and can start moving this process forward. Next slide. So a lot of information very quickly. So I appreciate your time and your attention. If you have any questions, I'm happy to answer questions here. Feel free to also shoot me an email and we can discuss via email, or I'm happy to set up a phone call. Thanks.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Tom, for your presentation. It was a really great overview of definitions to start out, and then climate data as well as impacts. I appreciated how you related directly to decision-making as well as partnerships. If you don't mind, I'd like to follow up with just a question or two before we move on to the next presenter.
Sure.
So you mentioned your experience with AT&T and telecom, but I was hoping you could give maybe a few more examples of other efforts related to infrastructure climate resilience that you've been involved with.
Yeah, sure. Actually, this gives me an opportunity to talk about a figure here that I didn't have a chance to. Could you go back a couple slides, Elizabeth?
Yeah.
To the where I showed the sort of flooded coastal energy infrastructure on the bottom right. This one, perfect. So the figure on the top right actually is more directly applicable to a transportation agency. This is one that was a project that we did in the Northeast. If folks know where the Presumpscot River is, that's in Maine, and we did a project up there that was focused on climate impacts. This is a tool called an IDF curve, an intensity, duration, frequency curve. It's what engineers use to size culverts and design bridge foundations and things like that to effectively look at flooding and stream flow. And so, this was another, through discussions with Maine DOT, they were concerned about, impacts to culverts. They were part of a federal highways pilot program that was looking at climate impacts there. And so we were able to take climate information we have, a lot of additional modeling, and start developing these IDF curves to help them understand what peak stream flows and rivers will look like in the future so that they can appropriately start designing something as mundane as a culvert today that will be climate resilient in the future. And we're able to deliver that kind of tool to them. One other example I'll touch on really quickly is, from another sector in the electric sector. The report's not out yet, so I won't say where we did the study, but it's a large city in the Northeast was concerned about the ability to deliver electricity during extreme heat waves. And so we worked with them to start modeling how extreme temperatures could affect not just you know, increases in demand as people were increasing or turning up their air conditioning during heat waves, and what would that do to, you know, increased electricity demand, but also how does extreme heat affect power plants' ability to generate electricity if they can't cool as easily if it's hot outside, and also the ability of the transmission grid to transmit that electricity, which in fact declines when you have extreme heats. So that's just a couple of other examples, not necessarily from telecom, but from other areas where we're able to, through these processes, collaboratively work towards, you know, more actionable information that could inform some of their planning decisions. And
could you just maybe just explain who directly did you work with in Maine and the electric example as well? Was it the utility?
Yeah. So it was again, the report's not published yet for the electric work. But we were working with the utilities as well as some of the major players in the city. In Maine, that was a project that was jointly between a number of organizations, but it was the Department of Homeland Security's Office of Infrastructure Protection, which has now been recently rebranded as Cyber Security and Infrastructure Security Agency. And through them, we collaborated with Maine DOT, the Metropolitan Planning Organization in the greater Portland metro area, and a couple of other smaller agencies up in that part of the country.
Wow, a lot of stakeholders in the game.
Yep.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Tom, for your presentation.
Yeah, thanks.
I'd like to now welcome our next speaker, who is Mr. Tim Kelly of Houston Metro. Now, Houston Metro has made some big changes over the past few years, including a complete redesign of its bus network, which has actually resulted in shorter transit trips and more riders on the system. So congratulations to Houston Metro on this massive undertaking and its success. As many of you know, Houston recently dealt with Hurricane Harvey, which hit in 2017, and it led to devastating flooding throughout Houston and throughout Metro's service area. And Houston Metro was prepared, but they also learned a great deal from this event, and Tim will share some of that with us today. So Tim, you may begin for your presentation.
Thanks a lot, Elizabeth. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk about some of the common sense lessons that we learned, not only during Harvey, but the previous 3 years. We've had 3 major flooding events here in our city. And in Harvey alone, Metro had $2.6 million of expenses for emergency transportation operations directly related to the event. And we suffered $12 million of damage to capital assets and rolling stocks. But the real issue on top of this, almost $15 million, was the human element. We had 500 of our fellow employees that were impacted by the storm that either had flooded vehicles or flooded homes. So just how do you continue this service to the public during this? We spent a lot of time on emergency planning and preparedness, and we all think we have the perfect plan. We're ready for everything. And I would echo Elizabeth's comments in the opening that the key is to be flexible. So I will start. Next slide. So we all start in all of our emergency preparednesses with our emergency plan. And as I said, the plan never covers everything. What we've learned, it's really important to review the plan regularly, and training of our staff members to the plan. It's important to remember that all of our staff have day jobs as well. They're not focused full-time on emergencies and preparedness, and we have to remind them of that. And for us, the primary threat is hurricane season, and we do a lot of pre-hurricane training. And traditionally, we've really focused on the operations folks because they're the ones impacted and the one you imagine. But what the biggest lesson, the takeaway over the last 3 flooding events, is the folks we deal with the most are not those operations and safety. So we've broken down to do training and input from smaller groups by discipline. And one of those is our customer service, our media, public information officer, really key to what we do. And I'll talk more about that. And probably the biggest impact that we've learned is sitting down with our finance, accounting, and risk management folks, and the importance of record keeping and good record keeping in responding to these events and in preparing for the future. But with that, the emergency plan has to be coordinated with local jurisdictions. I mean, all of our transit properties, we don't operate in a vacuum. We're part of the greater community. And to have success for all of us, we need to have that partnership. And I would encourage everybody, as you work on that partnership, to really reach out to your your peers, and what are their plans saying about you? What we learned many years ago is we had about 20 jurisdictions all expecting us to provide them unlimited buses for evacuation, and we didn't have that kind of resource to support everybody. So that communication and partnership is very important. And next slide. So we're fortunate in that the hub of our operational activities, bus, rail, and police control, are located at the region's Transportation and Emergency Management Center, which is Houston Transtar. And this is a facility that was designed specifically to withstand Category 4 hurricanes. It has generator power and fuel on hand to operate 7 days, water supply for 7 days. So we're in good shape. But even with all that planning, there's a lot of lessons through past events. One of them, the original building, had one shower, male, one shower for female. And you can imagine if you have several hundred people operating around the clock for some days, that's not quite adequate. We've addressed that problem. We also work to address where do these people sleep and catch up and rest when they're not working these around the clock hours. We added a joint conference center that would be converted to a sleeping area, male and female. I had the opportunity to walk into one of them, and the snoring was not in harmony, but it was pretty loud in the room. So that's a future task to look at how we deal with that. And a real key lesson is janitorial support. Most of us operate Monday through Friday businesses, but if we're running nonstop around the clock, how do you take care of that? The trash piles up pretty quickly in your building. But really, for those that don't have a dedicated regional center, do you have a plan for your, where are you going to run your operation during emergency? Do you have emergency power and water and supplies you need? And do you have a backup if for some reason that facility is not accessible? Do you have food and water? And just the support you need to be prepared there, because just lessons learned for us, be ready for the long haul. During Hurricane Harvey, we were fully activated 24/7 for 12 full days in Houston Transtar. So next slide, please. This is a pretty iconic picture that got a lot of coverage in transit publications. These are 120 buses that's from one of our bus operating facilities that's in a relatively flood-prone area. They were relocated to this elevated HOV segment adjacent to the facility. And honestly, this is something that's been in our emergency plan for over 15 years, never ever been implemented. But as we're in the central operations center and we're getting ready for the onslaught of this rain that was predicted, we got a call from this facility manager who says, hey guys, you know, if it's as bad as the forecast said, maybe we need to relocate our buses out here. Nobody had thought of that. So I guess it's an example of communications and tough decisions need to flow up and down the chain. And we implemented that based on that input from the facility. And I shared this at a recent APTA risk management conference. Is this picture really, to me, represents a potential $6 million insurance claim had we not relocated those buses. Next slide. So disaster recovery is really about having a plan, like the Emergency Operations Center alternatives and being prepared for anything. And I'll just tell a quick side story. In the green Army truck that's in this slide is something that's really we acquired as part of our own business continuity efforts. And if we needed to get to a facility that's flooded, or I half joke about it, if we maybe need to go pick up the payroll clerk that's his or her house that's in a flooded neighborhood, because I want to get everybody paid so they keep working. What we found out with our partnership was local emergency managers. They know we had this vehicle, and it was pressed into service beside the Houston Fire and Police Departments and was used for 72 hours straight doing active rescues out of floodwaters. So again, part of that, be flexible. A big part of our recovery and response is how do we restore transit service? We really think, well, we know in our business that transit is key to the success of a community. And the quicker that we can recover service, and it helps return the community some level of normalcy and less dependence, and people can use transit to go about their lives, to go get their own supplies as soon as the stores open and things like that. So we're very focused on returning service quickly. In Harvey, we stopped service just before midnight on a Saturday night when the streets just became impassable. On Tuesday, 2 days later, we had returned medically necessary paratransit trips. And the following Wednesday, just 3 days after the flooding started, we were operating limited rail and our lifeline routes, which are pre-identified routes. They're major ridership routes. There's 16 total, and they represent about 50% of our ridership. All of these were operating the third day after Harvey. And that didn't come by accident. That was a very methodical part of our plan. While we have one group that was actively doing rescue work and life-saving efforts, we had a separate team of staff, operations safety, our facilities folks, that were checking these 16 dedicated routes, seeing what we can open and making sure we were ready to do it. But again, part of our plan is to quickly, as safely as we can, return service to the community and our customers. Next slide. So just a little bit of flavor of the ongoing efforts, and really during the event, we spent a lot of time doing emergency evacuation shuttles from flooded neighborhoods where people were being rescued to shelters. We were part of the forward command locations of the unified command in these different neighborhoods. It's a really important effort. I think that your transit properties need to be involved in this unified command operation, not only at forward commands, but we were at a central command operation where we knew decisions were being made. We did things we never imagined. We did the high water vehicles I mentioned. We were involved in helicopter rescues that were being made from rooftops and dropping people off on freeway overpasses that we arranged transportation to shelters. We had a lot of requests. It took a lot of coordination, and I can talk to you for days about the lessons learned with all of that. But that continuing coordination in support of shelters in this emergency situation went on for weeks. And I mentioned to you, after 3 days, we had largely returned service. By the second Monday, 9 days later, we had full service operating, but we still had folks supporting the emergency operation. So it required a dedicated team of supervision and operations separate so we could do our normal business and continue to support our community. Next slide. So quickly, some of the lessons learned, specifically with Harvey. On-call contracts became very valuable to us. It's important, if you have on-call contracts, do they meet the FEMA procurement requirements so they competitively bid? And there's a whole list of things there. But that's important if you're in a declared disaster and you're going to seek reimbursement for that. Emergency management consultant was one of the things that we did several years ago, is to engage in consultant support for emergency, somebody that's a FEMA expert. They're involved in helping train our staff. They've developed a hazard mitigation plan. They have subcontractors on board that we used immediately to do damage assessment as soon as we could on our facilities. And they coordinate the funding agency, whether it's FEMA or the FTA Emergency Relief Program and our insurance program. So we have one seamless coordination. And the really important part is they follow up with the audit process. We're still being audited on FEMA recovery from Hurricane Ike in 2008. So that's really, really important. And then relevant drills. I talked a little bit about the training, but relevant drills broken down by discipline. One of the keys, and it really turned out to be a success in Harvey, is that customer service public information officer team. About 2 years ago, our marketing communications implemented full-time social media staff that work out of our control center. They were invaluable to getting real-time information to the public. Logistics, staffing requirements. If you anticipate you're going to be involved in evacuation, you got to get the staff there early. Once you get them there, you own them. So do you have food and other supplies to sustain them? Again, a difficult lesson for us in Harvey is we had several catering contracts. They were all from the same geographic part of town that flooded, so we scrambled to overcome that. Partnerships, you need the partnership. You don't want to meet somebody the first time a scene of emergency. And so that's a year-round effort. One of the great partnerships here is low floor buses don't go in very deep waters. We were asked to do a lot of evacuations through some water. We reached out to our partners, and Harris County Transit had contract with a private service that has school buses that we use to go in different areas to make those rescues. Without that partnership and ongoing relationships, we wouldn't have been able to deliver that service. And next slide. So some pre-storm guidance. And again, this is whether it's fire, flood, or tornado. These kind of things work in anticipation of a declared disaster, and the importance of record keeping, especially if you anticipate a FEMA or FTA recovery. We work with our finance department to set up a specific event project code so we can track all expenses. Record keeping and labor of equipment is so very important. If you send a bus to a specific mission, you need the bus number, you need the operator tied to that bus, you need hours involved. Was he on standby? You have to document it. There's a difference in FEMA or FTA emergency relief on that. Evacuations, are you prepared? Do you have the staff ready to support? Be part of the regional command center and decisions that are made. Work order for recovery, same kind of thing. Documentation is very important. Cost track, and then the delivery of your service is so important. We have contracts in place to push and clean our roads if we need to, so we can put service. And then I mentioned a little bit about social media. We use those folks very well. In this situation, the local media was nonstop covering this. And if you don't feed the bear, they're going to make up the story. So our social media began to immediately put those messages out. And we were able to communicate very effectively and correct any misinformation. And the next slide, I will just finish with a short video that's a very good highlight of Houston Metro and Harvey.
We know that there are certain areas prone to flood. We are stationing our equipment in such a way that we can get to those areas. Even Metro might have water vehicle buses available upon request.
But from a county point of view, we are geared up and ready to go. We will be here 24/7. We're going to follow the lead of the mayor and the judge and adapt our services based upon changing conditions.
Sandy Center, they're all going into major historic flood is forecast. Houston, 22 inches of rain. Tomball, 17 inches of rain. Hobby, 23 inches of rain. It's just devastating rain amounts.
It's a little more urgent situation here than it was just about an hour or so ago. Behind me, they've brought in a fleet of Houston Metro buses. I'll give you a closer look at those.
Certainly, we would not have been able to get people to the various shelters without the help of Metro. We certainly appreciate them. They have gone over and above.
Metro's primary focus has been and is in support of the continuing police and fire operations. We remain positioned to support, rescue, get people to the shelters.
Where are these buses going?
Right now, these buses are going to be headed to Dixon Road. Also with us from Metro, Jerome Gray. And Jerome, we want to welcome you here.
We're working very hard to bring on as much service as soon as possible. We have to check all the routes, make sure safety is not an issue.
Vía telefónica, la representante a Jackie Hill. Estamos teniendo servicios solamente para las personas que usan Metro.
We are working directly with the American Red Cross to help their trucks, which are loaded with supplies in bulk.
It is amazing to see the generosity of the folks here, Metro buses, everyone in the city pitching in.
I want to thank so very much the entire Metro staff and team for really giving it their all.
So with that, I'm happy to answer any questions from anybody, or you, Elizabeth.
Great. Thank you so much, Tim. That was an incredible story, so we really appreciate you sharing with us. It was also really great to hear directly from someone who's dealt with such an event head on, and you shared so many lessons learned. So I guess just one quick follow-up question I have is, and I imagine that, you know, you've taken these lessons learned to your own organization, perhaps made some changes. So I'm curious if there's anything that you've recently added to your toolkit that has worked really well for Houston Metro.
You know, a couple of things. Really, I think because this Harvey was such a large and devastating event and atypical of a hurricane for us, it was a very slow developing and continuous rain. We experienced as much as 50 inches of rain in parts of our region. Just the magnitude, I think the addition of having a consultant to help us, the expertise with FEMA and what we ended up with the FTA emergency relief funding to help coordinate staff and the documentation and paperwork, I'm not sure we would have been as successful. We had demands from our board of directors immediately. What's our exposure? What's our losses? Because of that coordination and the daily meetings, totally separate from delivery services in the background, prepared us to better deal with that and now the ongoing recovery of money. So just having that consultant on board, and there's several out there, I don't mention any names, there's more than one that can do the kind of work, but did prove to be invaluable for us.
Wonderful. Okay, thank you very much, Tim. We'll just stay with one question because we're a little behind, but now we're going to switch gears a little from climate-related events to talk more about whole systems power resiliency. So let me welcome our last speaker, Mr. Carlos Ortega. He's from Marta in Atlanta, Georgia, and over the past few years, Marta has developed pretty extensive system engineering and transit asset management processes within their organization. In fact, Marta has just achieved, I believe it was in this past month in March, the prestigious International Standard for Asset Management, ISO 55000 certification, joining the ranks only of London Underground and Singapore Mass Rapid Transit as a global transport leader in asset management. So congratulations to you, Carlos, and to the rest of the Marta team. APTA is really excited to learn from you and your success. And with that, Carlos, please take it away.
Well, thank you, Elizabeth, and thank you to my fellow panelists. Like Elizabeth said, I mean, we are very, very proud of having received this ISO 55000 certification. And now we're really among the very few in the world that have that their certification, and we are very proud. It was my ex-boss's and pet peeve, and he is now the chief of rail operations, and it has helped immediately to immensely to go through this process of certification, and particularly when it comes to the resiliency and redundancy of our systems. We have things now in our asset management system that contribute to it let us know, and we have a lot of information now that helps predict when things are going to fail, particularly with climate. I mean, if we're talking about a roof, you know, how long can you expose a roof, you know, to water and sun, that kind of thing. It's incredibly helpful. I was very impressed with Dr. Wall's explanation on the amount of data that we can collect nowadays, particularly for something like climate events. And of course, I lived in Florida for 35 years, so I know exactly what hurricanes are. One year we got hit by 3. So it is quite devastating. I understand what goes on there. But now I want to focus on how systems engineering approached resiliency for rail systems in particular. We have many rail systems in the United States, and the way it worked throughout the years is we absolutely depended on lessons learned from these other transit authorities that had built systems before us. Our system, you know, became Can you please move to the next slide? So Marta was established in 1971, and we started building rail tracks. So we now have 48 miles, 38 stations. We're not the largest in the U.S., but not the smallest. We're 9th largest transit system. We have a lot of employees, and we move about 600, well, close to 600,000 passengers per day. We have a large bus fleet. We're going and hoping that we can convert that completely to compressed natural gas and some electric buses. we have also paratransit, or what we call mobility, where we are use a large number of vans to actually move door to door people that need medical services, for example, or just they need to go to buy something at the grocery store. So can I have the next slide, please? So what I want to talk about specifically is, how we build resiliency into our systems when we design them. I want to give I know Dr. Wall actually mentioned the definition of resiliency, but I want to quote what the International Council of Systems Engineering says as far as resiliency, and it's the ability to prepare and plan for, absorb or mitigate, recover from, or more successfully adapt to actual potential adverse events. So see, since back then in the 70s, we didn't have all this wonderful data that we have nowadays. We depended a lot on lessons learned from other communities and other transit agencies. So let's talk a little bit about power systems, how we make them resilient, and how communications, what have we done to get those communication systems stay up and be able to use them even throughout the most severe weather events or power failures. So we also have not only rail but alternate modes of transportation, like I mentioned, buses and mobility. Can I please have the next slide? So let's talk about traction power or power systems in general, but let's first talk about traction power. This is specifically the electrical power that we use to feed our rail system. We use a third rail, but this works very similarly if you have a catenary system with the wires overhead. So we have built into our system, and this is from the design, from the inception, we looked at doing this. Include dual feeds for power from the local power producing authority, which is Georgia Power in our case. We have redundant substations. We segment our system, our track. Imagine a long track, and every so often we put a substation that actually feeds a dedicated piece of that third rail and also the adjacent ones. And I'll go into a little bit of detail with an animation later on that. We also have our auxiliary switchgear system that powers the stations and things like the lights, train control rooms, all the other stuff that it's not a part of the traction power system. And we do have generators and UPSs, and we have designed that to give us at the station level about 8 hours of uptime, so that we can easily evacuate and get everybody to safety before the actual power shuts down. And we do have a very, very robust state of good repair program. I mean, it's there's no use in designing all this resiliency, even though we use very, very high quality materials and parts, if we don't maintain them. So that's very, very important. It's one of the things that we have learned throughout the years, that it is extremely important to maintain these very, very complex systems. Can I have the next slide, please? So this is how a typical traction power substation works. We get very, very high voltage and alternate current from Georgia Power. We run that through our switch gear. And then we step it down using a transformer to 750 volts, still alternate current. So then we rectified and converted into 750 volt direct current. We run that through our switch gear, DC, direct current switch gear, and then we feed it straight to our distribution system on the tracks through that third rail. So that all the power from these substations is what makes the trains move. and have lights and be able to communicate. Next slide, please. So this is a typical station. You see on your left the Georgia Power feed. Of course, it doesn't look like that, but that was just a representation. And the AC switch gear, transformers, rectifiers, and how that is fed through underground cables to our rail cars, basically. And on our design, we have redundancy, and we built that on purpose when we designed the system. Next slide, please. So this is basically the design is the same for the auxiliary power. And can you click one more, please? There we go. As you see, the auxiliary power feeds the station lights, the fans, the emergency telephones, the UPS batteries, the train control room, and anything else that runs on that needs power on any of our stations. So the process is very similar, and we use this concept called main tie main that really is just a breaker that when you have two things to feed and you have two things to feed from, even if one of them goes down, we can still feed the two outputs using a breaker that actually switches one way, or it's either open or closed to provide power. Next slide, please. So this is an animation then, and it's very interesting because here you can see this is just an example, right? You have traction power substation 1, 2, and 3. And of course, at the very beginning, you only feed two pieces of this electrified rail, right? The third rail. And you have a primary and then the adjacent one that you feed. Then the station on the middle, the TPSS on the middle, number 2, actually feeds the two adjacent ones plus the main one that is designed to power. And all these traction power substations are rooms that are strategically built throughout the system. They're very resilient to weather, and we put them at regular distances so that we are covered throughout the entire system. So let's move to the next slide. If, for example, we get a lightning strike and that particular TPSS goes down, or cables are cut for whatever reason, we still are able to supply power to those two sections of third rail that actually belonged to that the TPSS number 2. But we want to go one step further. And next, click again, please. When we do that, which nowadays we do it manually, but with our upgrades that we're planning to our traction power subsystem, this will be an automatic connection. By tying those two third rails, we actually provide redundancy. It's almost like that TPSS number 2 didn't exist ever. Next, click again, please. So at that point, we can do, let's say, if all we had to do was just preventive maintenance, we can isolate that particular substation and work on it to fix it. Let's say it got damaged because of a weather event, or it was just equipment that went bad. We are able to work on it without really affecting our rail operations. People can still move through it. Everybody's happy. Once we have solved the problem, click again, please. Again. We can reconnect everything, and then one more. Bring power back, and everything is back to normal, like nothing had happened. And really, the service was not affected at all, even though we actually lost a great big piece of equipment right there. But throughout this design of resiliency into the system and duplicity, we get the results that we need, and that is to keep the trains running. Next slide, please. So let's look at communication systems, which are rather important. That's how we keep, the police, Marta Police Department connected to other jurisdictional authorities like Atlanta Police or, even the state. And it's I'm very proud of this because we actually built this system to be separate. We own it. We maintain it. It's private. We don't experience cell overloads. And I'm going to give you an example of a weather-related event that we had here later. And when you have thousands, hundreds of thousands of people trying to use cellular, the telephones, the cell phones to communicate, then they become useless. A radio system, it's so robust that it will continue to communicate and allow us to coordinate what needs to happen in case of an emergency. On the station level, we have emergency telephones that are connected, of course, to the uninterrupted power supplies and generators when available. And our fiber optic system network is routed through different rings. I mean, I'm talking about separate alternate path, diverse path. And we have, of course, more than one core location, so that if one of those main locations goes down, we still can operate through that fiber network system. Next slide, please. The other thing that we do, and we understand, I mean, not only from our own experience, but from other agencies, is how important it is to keep our customers informed, particularly in the case of an emergency. So we're putting out there, I mean, we have a lot of it already working. This system called AVIS, which is Audio-Visual Information System. And basically it's an enhanced public address system with a lot of visual messaging signs. So we have these rather large monitors where we normally just provide, next train arrival information, delays and that kind of thing. But in case of an emergency, they become a magnificent tool, to keep the public informed. We want to be able to, in case of an emergency, evacuate a station with no incidents, keep people calm. So you keep them informed, they know where they need to go. And of course, we have also a what we call a Marta application for cell phones or intelligent devices that provides exactly the same information that we provide to those signs. Next slide, please. So let me talk about a little bit what happened here back in 2014, and we call it Snowmageddon. And it wasn't really a lot of snow, but honestly, the city wasn't prepared to handle it. The logistics, behind getting the plows out there, getting the salt vehicles, to prep the streets and the highways didn't happen. Then you had a logistical error, which was to let everybody out of work at the same time. So it ended up in complete chaos and gridlock throughout the city. There was a lot of ice on the road, and because of the lower temperatures, and that became a problem because every so often, an accident was inevitable. So the lines were incredibly big. So people, spent, they spent the night on cars, even though, Atlanta opened their hearts, and let people in to stores, Home Depots, office buildings, wherever there was someone, that could offer shelter. That happened. So that's how we didn't end up with having, more casualties and more people ending up in the hospital. Next slide, please. So throughout Snowmageddon, we had the opportunity to do a wonderfully grateful system shutdown. We, of course, immediately modified service to suit, the emergency that was going on. There were no train services disruptions, of course. There are limitations on how when we can run the trains in a circumstance like this where we have all that ice and snow. But we were running pretty much throughout the whole event. We got the buses off the street as they needed to be, but we had them operating almost the next day. We had the change some tires, and we were moving people because there was a lot of individuals that lost their vehicles. We didn't lose too many of our own vehicles, that got stranded, fortunately, and we kept the public informed. That is key to get through an event like this. May I have the next slide? So lessons learned. Resiliency, of course, is crucial. We had our radio communications that stayed up throughout the entire event. Our power stayed up even though there were extensive power outages throughout the city and the other counties. There were no rail service disruptions. Safety and security of the system was kept, and we were able to provide and maintain situational awareness throughout the event. That means that we were prepared. We were really prepared when perhaps some other parts of the city were not. So we were able to help in that instance. Next slide, please. So as part of the lessons learned, and not only through this Snowmageddon incident, but many others, we understood the criticality of having a single integrated operations center. Bunker-like, it's built to take a lot of punishment and stay up. We have dual power feeds to that location. And we have a private Marta data connections, and this is done through fiber. And also we utilize commercial links as an addition. We have a facility that can handle a lot of staff, and we have food, drinks. We have restrooms, showers, sleeping quarters for pretty much everybody that needs to be there. Next slide, please. That concludes my presentation. So Elizabeth, take it back.
Great, thank you so much, Carlos. That was really interesting and relevant, and it really highlighted how agencies need to be thinking about what needs to be done to keep their systems up and running, and then to be prepared for whatever emergency situation. I'm just going to follow up with a quick.
I'm sorry, and how we rely on each other, to obtain that information and share it.
Exactly. So if you don't mind, I'm just going to follow up with a quick question. It's a little more climate related, but Atlanta is pretty far inland, so I don't think sea level rise or hurricanes provide a direct threat to the Marta system. And it's not really in the typical path for tornadoes or an earthquake. So I guess my question would be, what are the major threats to Marta's systems?
You're correct. I mean, we're inland, and we have really very little, like a hurricane. By the time it gets to so far inland, it has lost most of its strength. But we do have a few tornadoes here and there, and the heat. I mean, we're down south, so definitely we have extreme heat, high temperatures for longer periods of time, and our equipment gets affected by that. I've been in the traction power substations where we have equipment with plastic legs and they're melted. That's how extreme the heat can get. So we have to build in this conditioning of these rooms to keep the equipment working, under optimal conditions. We also have, flash floods, extreme precipitation, a lot of lightning strikes. And we occasionally have a winter storm like the one I just showed you a minute ago. So, yeah, I mean, we're not the worst, but we get hit by weather, events.
Yeah, it sounds like it, and some longer impacts as well,
yes,
perhaps.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Great. Well, thank you so much, Carlos. I really appreciate it. And
My
I actually
pleasure.
want to take this time to thank all the panelists for their presentations. They were it's hard when you have so much good information to share in such a little amount of time. I'm sure each presenter could have an hour to themselves, but thank you. We really appreciate it. So now we're going to move on to the panel discussion portion of our webinar. And we'll keep it short because we are running out of time. We likely will go over time, just an FYI to participants, so that we can address some of your audience questions as well. And just a reminder, if you do have questions, you can submit them through the question box on the side of the screen, and then we will address as many as we can. So I'm going to start with one question for the entire panel, and that's, in your view or your experience, what's the greatest challenge for either infrastructure organizations or transit agencies in pursuing climate resilience? And Carlos and Tim can approach it from a transit agency perspective, or Tom could take just a different industry if you want. But yeah, if someone would mind addressing that question.
Sure, this is Tom. I'm happy to start.
I think, you know, one of the challenges that we run into is that there's, especially with climate resilience, is that there's some uncertainty around various aspects of that. And I don't mean to say that there's doubt that the climate's changing, but really that, you know, the timing of changes and sort of the extent and magnitude of changes there's some uncertainty in those types of predictions and projections moving forward. And so, you know, trying to quantify those uncertainties are really the challenges. You know, I say this as an engineer that, you know, I would really love it if someone could just give me one number and say, this is the climate that we have to plan for in the future, and this is what the peak temperatures will be. And really, you know, there are different methods to working with uncertainty. It's certainly the climate models, we can begin to bound uncertainty and say, look, it's not that this is the peak wind velocity or the peak temperature or the flood depth to plan for, but here's a range, and you know, it's our job to try and make that range as absolutely as small as possible. But it's really, you know, agencies trying to either, you know, accept that there's some uncertainty and move forward, or looking at other strategies, adaptive planning or real options approaches to being able to address that uncertainty and move forward.
Yeah, I agree. Communication is a huge part of it. Tim and Carlos, would you agree, or do you have a different perspective, perhaps?
So I think I would agree with Tom, and the real issue is what's the target out there, and things are changing. Just with Harvey, who would predict 50 inches of rain? I've got a traction power substation we're now going to relocate that was flooded during Harvey that's never been in any flood zone. So it's hard to anticipate the future with the unknown.
I agree. It's impossible to actually predict the future, but we do our best. I mean, particularly studying what has happened in the past, and we try to be prepared. We want to build those infallible buildings, but it's not quite possible yet.
Right, and unfortunately, maybe some of these events might make you more prepared or realize that you need to have better strategies to be more prepared for the next event.
Yep, even a bad experience is an experience.
Right. So we are going to just go ahead and move on to questions from the audience in the interest of time, if that's all right with all the panelists.
Yes.
And I'll just take them from the question box, and I'll address them to the appropriate panelists. So this one is for Tim at Houston Metro. Is Houston Metro seriously planning for zero-emission buses? And are there any active discussions on power resiliency?
You know, right now we're committed to near zero emission in CNG. We're continuing to study zero emission in electric buses. I will say that it is a concern in our climate and proximity to hurricanes and the ability to be without power. What is the impact of that? So those are all questions that we're studying going forward with no firm answers.
Great. And Tim, how did Houston Metro obtain the funding for military type large tile vehicle PreStorm? Was it FTA funding?
So no, they weren't. Those are all part of the government surplus program. We now have a fleet of 5 of those trucks, and I think we have less than $10,000 in each truck from the government surplus program, and then we rehabbed them all with local money.
Great. And then, Tom, we have a question about specific climate variables. Could you maybe talk a little bit, give some more examples, talk a little more about how maybe the difference between exposure to climate changes versus what the actual impacts are?
Yeah, sure. So I think, let's see if I can answer this question, and whoever asked it, please re-ask if I don't quite hit the mark. But the real question is that a climate model puts out just very general types of variables and temperature and precipitation. And so really, I think what I'm trying to, the distinction between raw climate variables or raw output from a climate model and climate impact information is what needs to be done to take what a climate model produces and conduct additional analysis, additional modeling, what have you, to move to something that's more directly indicative of how it could impact your systems or your operations. And so, the example that I gave is climate models do not output directly flooding. I mean, they can try to do it, but they don't do it well. And what they do produce is precipitation and rainfall information. And so all of that information they produce can inform additional modeling activities or additional analytical activities to arrive at, how does precipitation cause flooding to occur locally? How does it change floodplain boundaries? How does it, what are flood depths at various locations? And, through those processes, you can get even more locally relevant information. So I mentioned that climate models produce, at best right now, 12-kilometer resolution data. With additional modeling, we can get flood information down to a 200-meter grid across an area, which is, I would say, can inform sort of neighborhood level decisions. But there's all kinds of different stuff. Another one that I'll mention, because Carlos had mentioned temperature impacts to substations and how that can affect, the switching gear. Climate models put out different types of temperature information. Before I started this, I was not immediately aware of different types of temperature information you get. There's what they call dry bulb and wet bulb. And so dry bulb is just what the thermometer reads. Wet bulb is with the impacts of humidity. So that is what is sort of the felt temperature or the heat index type of information. Dry bulb's great for equipment. Wet bulb is really important for workforce. The thermometer may only say it's 90 degrees outside, but with humidity effects, the wet bulb temperature feels a lot hotter. And so there's certain OSHA standards for what your workforce can do outside, during these types of potentially more extreme temperatures in the future. So it's really trying to find exactly what is that type of information that impacts your business, your workforce, your infrastructure, or your practices. And it may not come directly from a climate model. It may be something that we need to do a little bit of additional work, analysis, or modeling to get to that information.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for talking more about that, Tom. The next question is for Carlos. With regards to the Snowmageddon, how did Marta prepare to prevent snow-related problems on the train guideway? So that specifically for the third rail, track switches, running rail, etc.?
Yes, well, we have equipment that we rail cars are outfitted to de-ice both the track where they run and the third rail. Let me tell you, I mean, we were not completely infallible. We had issues with ice, like pretty much everybody else, but we were fortunate enough and prepared enough. We're able to communicate well enough that we got through the entire thing pretty much unharmed, and we're able to provide a very, very needed service to the community. When you cannot use your vehicle, then you have to depend on something else to move you around. And there were instances, where people needed to get to hospitals. So that was very, very important.
Great, thank you, Carlos.
My pleasure.
And then this question is for Tim. How much of the preparedness for environmental threats did you use contracted resources to create your plans? I see that you use these resources during the event, but how about before?
The contractor resources right now are in the process of developing a hazard mitigation plan for the agency, and I'm told we're only the second transit property that's done that. One of the things that does for us into the future allows us to be eligible for future FEMA mitigation funding to help address some of the things we've talked about. I'm not sure that answers the question, but that kind of sends you down the right trail.
Yes, it does. Thank you so much. And then we'll just end with one more question for all the panelists to address, and that's, in your perspective, how can we advance the resiliency field, or where do you see it in about 5 years? And anyone can take that question on.
I'm happy to take a shot. This is Tim, and it really part of my message is from every event we learn new lessons, and for every real event we should be conducting after-action reviews and lessons learned, and not just documenting those lessons, but making changes to our plans and our preparedness and our response. Because, as I've said, I don't think we'll ever prepare for any potential situation.
I agree. This is Carlos, by the way. It is extremely important to learn from all these events and share that information. Make sure that one of the things that I consider extremely important is to keep our patrons informed and safe. And we need to really, really prepare for that.
Yeah, and this is Tom. I think, I think that moving from, especially in the climate perspective, we've historically been looking at adaptation of physical infrastructure and practices, and really resilience, sort of as a broader concept, discusses response, planning, a much broader approach to this. And I think that, the next 5 years, I'm hopeful that climate adaptation in particular certainly broadens and comes to this more holistic approach to climate resiliency in all parts of business, be it engineering, but also workforce, finance, everything.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. So we did not get to all the questions that we received, and I just want to let audience members know that we'll follow up with these questions and address them. And with that, I think that we will conclude today's webinar. So please join me in thanking our panel members, Dr. Tom Wall, Mr. Tim Kelly, and Mr. Carlos Ortega. And I also want to thank all the audience members and participants. Thank you so much for being part of today's webinar. Clearly, this topic of resiliency is growing ever more important in our transportation systems, and APTA hopes to continue sharing these best practices and these past experiences and learning from them so that we can continue the operations of our services that are so vital. I also want to let you know that today's slides and the audio recording, as well as some additional resources, will be posted on the APTA website within the next couple weeks, and it will actually be on the webinar series page. I also want to tell you that APTA-U's next Future View webinar will be on the topic of technology trends. And this will take place on Wednesday, June 5th, 3 to 4:15 p.m. Eastern Time. So thank you very much to our panelists and to everyone else for joining us today, and we hope to see you at future sessions.